Just waiting for a second to see if anybody else is coming in, one or two. Please come down the front so that latecomers can fill in at the back without having to come down the front. So welcome here, everybody. My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of SIPRI, and I'm really delighted to see so many people come out on a cold Monday evening in November of all times of the year. So thank you for coming. And I think that it reflects really, we've had a very good response to the invitation when we put it out. And I think it reflects that feeling that we all have that, you know, there is so much going on and we want to be understanding it. We want to, we have a lot of thoughts about it. We have a lot of feelings about it. There's evidence and information to think about, analysis, and also psychology and emotion. So I think that it's that complex set of issues in what some people are referring to as the polycrisis. Well, it seems that every time you turn around, I think that's a line from a Bob Dylan's song, isn't it? Seems like every time you turn around, there's another hard luck story that you got to hear. And you can get kind of, just worn down by it. But at the same time, you can engage with it and we can see how to understand it and whether there are some options, some openings for moving forward in a world which is confusing, not just because it's producing bad things, but because it's changing. The world order is changing, and that's part of our theme this evening. I want to, as well as welcoming you, welcome the online audience, and also, in a sense, the future online audience, because once these things go up on SIPRI channels, we've seen that they get watched over a considerable period of time. We're very pleased about that. Let me introduce to you members of the panel who are my bosses. This is the members of the governing board of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Beginning here closest to where I will be sitting is Jessica Matthews, former president of the Carnegie Endowment. Sitting next to her is Heng-Chi Chan, who is a special ambassador for Singapore and a long-time serving diplomat. Sitting in the middle here, name escapes me for the moment, Stefan Löfven, who is the chair of the governing board of SIPRI and, of course, former prime minister and former leader of the Social Democratic Party. Sitting next to Stefan is Patricia Lewis, who is head of the International Security Program at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. Next to her, Jean-Marie Guénaud, former Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations in the United Nations, and now teaching at Columbia University. And further along, last but not least in terms of the lineup, is Mohammed Ibn Chambas, who has such a long and outstanding record as a international civil servant, as a public servant. It's hard to know which to pick. But Mohammed was in ECOWAS, the Economic Organization of West African States, as that became a serious, well-founded, consolidated organization. Mohammed was in there in the driving seat. He has been the special representative of the UN Secretary General. He's now special representative for the African Union on silencing the guns. What we're going to do is spend a bit of time discussing Israel, Palestine, and the Gaza war, different perspectives, how it looks to different individuals coming from different places and different backgrounds. Then we're going to drop that, stop it, and start talking about a number of other issues. Those of you who've come to one or two of these meetings before know that sometimes I kind of spring surprises on the board members in order to, have my fun. But this time, actually, I've told them what themes I'm going to be asking them about, if not the precise wording of the question. And then we will take a little a lap or two around the panel doing that. And then I hope the last third of the meeting, then we'll open up for questions from all of you, and there'll be a roving mic to ask questions in the usual way. So with that, on we go. And I'm going to start with Jessica because you're closest to me. I didn't fix the seating. I told you to sit where you like. You picked here. That's very nice, but your penalty is you kick us off. 7th of October, the Hamas incursion, the atrocities, the awful news. Since then, the Israeli mobilization, now more recent, the bombing of Gaza and the entry of ground forces into Gaza. How do you understand it, and how do you understand reactions in America to it?
I think that the initial reaction was a sense of being appalled by this attack, and a kind of a knee-jerk pro-Israeli sentiment, very widespread in the U.S. Both political parties who see being pro-Israeli as very helpful for them in, to be crude but honest, in fundraising. So then, as each day has passed, a growing sentiment that is being appalled at what's happening in Gaza, which has been growing steadily. It has gotten very confused on the far left from a sense that there is a connection to colonialism in being concerned about Palestinian welfare. And you know what it shows, well, and I should say one other thing, which is there has been a very sharp uptick in anti-Semitic incidents of violence against synagogues, against other obviously Jewish institutions. But just to say finally, what it shows about the country, maybe this is true of other countries as well, is that by and large it has proven impossible for people to hold two ideas in their mind at once. You know, one thing is terrible and another thing is terrible. And you, so far, there's just about no organized body of opinion that is capable of exploring that. And finally, I would just say politically, I think that there was I think that the Biden administration really responded brilliantly on many counts to this, with the president's very strong backing of Israel, with his very strong comment from day one to others who might think of broadening the conflict. I think before any of us really thought of this as broader, saying don't, and his movement of an aircraft carrier group into the region, all of that very, very strong. But now they are under tremendous pressure to get a change in Israeli behavior. And so far, it has proven not yet possible.
I think one of the striking things, isn't it, is the way in which, as you said, this difficulty of holding two ideas or two sides of the story in your head at the same time. And I think that that is a theme that there's increasing kind of thought about, the reflection about. Only if you only tell half the story, then you are indeed only telling half the story. That means it's a really incomplete account. And yet this is one of those conflicts which it seems particularly hard to hold the two thoughts at the same time.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's entire. I mean, the level of gut level outrage about what's happening is difficult to hold, but it should never be that hard to hold two.
It shouldn't be.
Two ideas. It's only two ideas, right? But it also requires some knowledge of history about which the American population doesn't have.
Heng-Chi, seen from Southeast Asia, Singapore, how do you understand this, and how's sentiment in your country and in your region, as far as you can gather, seeing it?
Let me start by saying that Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, you can call it either, has about 280 million or 290 million Muslims. there are 3 Muslim majority countries, and every country of the 10 all have Muslim minorities. In Singapore, we have 14% of our population Muslim. So there's a natural sympathy for Palestine, Gaza, and certainly the defining issue for the position of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, where they stand if they have to choose between the US and China. They said they would choose China because of Palestine. This was way before this attack, this war. Singapore is different because Israel helped us build up our military, so we have a special collaboration relationship with Israel. When the whole thing started, I think we were the only ASEAN country to condemn the Hamas terrorism. We left it at that, and said this was crossing the borders, a violation of international law. We have 14% Muslims that were seething and very unhappy, but we held this line. But when we saw what happened, and Israel amassed 300,000 troops, and then the bombardment started, we came up with the line that Israel has a right to self-defense. Hamas committed terrorism, but Israel has to conduct the war according to international law and the laws of war. And we voted with the UN resolution to protect civilians. In fact, all of the ASEAN countries voted for that except Philippines, which abstained, and Cambodia, for some reason, didn't vote at all because they said that's really being neutral, So, but all of us voted for the resolution, and as you know, the resolution calls for a humanitarian truce leading to the cessation of hostilities. So the whole of the region would be supportive and want some kind of ceasefire. And most of us say two-state solution. So that's where we stand. I agree with Jessica. It's not difficult to hold two ideas in one's mind. We're not binary, and we can deal with contradictions. So yes. But I think that about describes my region's feelings. Strong.
So, Stefan, I want to move straight on to you and pass one particular thing out of what Heng-Chi said, which is to do with the emphasis on international law. Because one of the things which comes up, which you do hear, is if international law is so important over Ukraine, how come international law, different body, part of international law, but international humanitarian law, seems not to be so important for the West when it comes to Gaza and the Palestinians? How do you respond to that kind of line of thought and line of criticism?
No, I don't really. I don't think it's correct to say that. I think what I've heard is again and again and again, right to self-defense, yes, but in accordance with international law, humanitarian law, UN Charter, human rights, all that. So I think that's then how to interpret it. That's the hard thing. How far can you go? So the Israelis say the Palestinians are hiding them. The Hamas, are hiding themselves in a hospital or wherever. So humanitarian law, in my view, is still requires that you can't act the way you want, even with that. So, but it's not up to me, or I think it's tough for anyone to do that interpretation. But I can't say I've heard the West saying that international law doesn't matter.
No, I haven't heard the West saying that either, but I have heard people saying they have heard that.
Okay, right? Well, that's.
It's the oral in AU, the ear equivalent of optics. And what you see is sometimes not exactly what is there. Sometimes what you hear is not precisely what was said.
Can I just add that I think it's very important that we stick to that, because as you said, people, it seems as if you have to take side. Someone, and after 7th of October, it was, of course, the Israeli side, and after a while now, it's the Palestinian side. I think it's very important to stay with international law, humanitarian law, UN Charter, and all that. This is where we stand, and we stand supporting both of these parties, because then it gives us a chance to both criticize when we should criticize, but also to point to the path forward. And that is, of course, I mean, Palestinians need to make an effort. It is a problem that we have Hamas ruling in the Gaza Strip. It's a terrorist organization. That's a problem. It is a problem with the settlements and the settlers, the West Bank. That is a problem. So if we focus and stick to this is our focus, I think so that people don't have to take side. Who am I cheering for? We need to support both of them and still stick to the two-state solution. Two-state solution. I must say personally, I've been very doubtful the last year or so. Is it possible at all? Palestinians still say it is. The Palestinian leadership say it is. So as long as they say that, I think we need to stick to that.
Patricia, how do you read things?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is so difficult. Jessica talked about holding two thoughts in one's head, and I say hold the human being in your head and in your heart. Because they're just people. They're just ordinary people, peaceful people, who've been caught up in this on both sides. I agree for both. The October the 7th attacks were horrific, absolutely horrific. And I think we saw a very different Hamas to the type of Hamas we've seen before. I think we have to understand what that means for the future. And the bombing now in Gaza is terrifying. And we feel the pain of everyone on both sides of that border. And we wonder how this bombing will bring back the hostages alive. I think that's the other thing, if we hold the people in our hearts. I think what we're seeing right now is the failure, culmination of years of failure of the peace process. In addition, I think it's the failure of Israeli intelligence, which is a very hard thing for us to talk about. I think it's even harder in Israel. And also the Israeli attempts to deter Hamas. There was obviously the sense they were being deterred. Well, no, there was no deterrence. And that's a really important thing for us to factor in. So I would say that what we need to focus on is bringing the hostages home. All of them should go back. I know they're part of a negotiation, but the children should go home immediately. The idea of capturing little children and keeping them now for over a month in tunnels without their parents and without their parents even knowing, sorry, I'm going to get upset. How can they be held hostage under any sense of human feeling? And, equally, how can the children of Gaza be bombed and the babies in hospitals be left in the situation that they're in now? The elderly, the disabled need to be released. And two wrongs don't make a right. And I think the street process that we're seeing around the world, there is obviously a political element to it. We're seeing very much about Free Palestine. I think if you spoke to most people on those street protests, what they'd be saying is they want the war to stop, want the killing to stop, and they want a peace process to begin. And I think that people generally just want their leaders to stop waging war. A lot of people are saying, not in my name. I think that's both sides of the border. I think most people in Gaza would say, I did not want Hamas to go across the border and do that to ordinary, peaceful people who were helping Palestinians. So the big thing, I think, is for the war to stop and the peace process to begin. And that takes a lot of leadership. And we're seeing, with the Russia-Ukraine war, which we've talked about before, we're not seeing that sort of leadership in the world at the moment. And we've really got to focus on how to bring that type of leadership back, I think.
Thanks, Patricia. And so if I go on to Jean-Marie, I'll sort of let the ball pass along to you. Yes, we want the war to stop. what's the possibility and a peace process to be set going? Because without a peace process to be going, it's just a problem suspended and it'll come back. So what do you think is the possibility of that? The stopping the war, a peace process set going, and where does the drive for that come from?
Well, to be very honest with you, I'm quite pessimistic because I think there are no interlocutors for the peace process and no credible mediators. There is no interlocutor because the present Israeli government is not interested in a peace process, not at all. Actually, the best interest of the Israeli government, as it is composed, is to keep the war going on so that the prime minister can stay in power as long as possible. And in Palestine, I think the Palestinian Authority is largely discredited. And so the notion that it can tomorrow step up and be an interlocutor is very difficult. I think in terms of mediators, and maybe Jessica will disagree with me, but I think in an electoral year, the United States is not going to take massive political risk, and it's as a mediator, it's not seen as a mediator by many people. It in the General Assembly, it votes there's only 5 other countries which support the the U.S. position against the resolution. So the United States is ruling itself out as a mediating power. So what is to be done? I think at some point the United Nations will have to step in politically, but Israel, certainly this present Israeli government would have none of it. So it requires a political crisis in Israel that leads to a different government that would be open to a serious political engagement. I think on the Palestinian, so that will take time. I think on the Palestinian side, there are few people of credibility. Maybe someone like Barghouti, because he has the credential of having been in jail for many years. Now, would an Israeli government be willing to contemplate him as an interlocutor? Obviously, certainly not this one. Maybe at some point another government. But the tragedy is that all that takes time. And I haven't mentioned Europe, but I think Europe is tragically divided at the moment. We have seen it in the Resolution of Security Council, some European, not in the Security, in the General Assembly, some European countries voting for, some abstaining, some voting, a few voting against. So a deeply divided Europe, which reflects deeply divided memories in Europe. I think there is obviously the memory of the Holocaust and the memory of the Evian conference, where there were no takers to accept Jews fleeing persecution. And so that means that the European rightly feel that they have a special duty toward Israel, because at the hour of peril in 1938, they were not willing, nor were the United States or Canada for that matter, but they were not willing to accept fleeing Jews. But at the same time, the other Europe now is a diverse continent. It's a continent where there are many citizens who come from the former colonies of the colonial empires of Europe. And they see in Israel one dimension of Israel, which is only one dimension. It's a caricature to say Israel is a colonial enterprise, but there is a dimension that is can be perceived as colonial. And so they see in the timidity of Europe to call for what it is. I mean, the disproportionate response of Israel to the horrific attack of Hamas. They see that as a sort of colonial reaction, to be honest, where when it comes to supporting white Ukrainian European. The Europeans are ready. When it comes to supporting an Arab, they're not ready. And I think that means that this Israel-Palestine conflict has a deeper, more deeply divides domestic public opinion than any other conflict that I can think of.
Yes, I react that way too, Jessica. So Mohammed, if I come to you now and ask you the same question, and perhaps as well you can sort of absorb into your answer some reflection on what your colleagues on the board have said. How is the issues themselves being perceived, and what extent is there some kind of sense that they really can be addressed? Yeah, over to you.
Well, let me recognize my former boss and my friend, Yanni Ellison. And I'd like to take recourse behind two statements. One by Secretary General Guterres, when he said that what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, is not happening in a vacuum. Some didn't particularly like that, but that's true. There's a background. Unfortunately, not a very pleasant background, and it probably goes back to what UN was set up to do, is prevention, prevention, prevention. There hasn't been sufficient prevention in this case, and what happened is not surprising. And second, it was Obama, who also said that when you look at the situation now and what is unfolding, no one has clean hands, referring, of course, to the major stakeholders, whether it's superpower like the US, whose role is very preponderant there, whether it's Europe, or even the countries in the region, including the Middle Eastern countries, that no one's hands are clean. So it's calling for deeper reflection that as horrified as we all are, first of all, by the Hamas attacks in Israel, and then, of course, secondly, by the disproportionate response of Israel and the ongoing atrocities, we ought to simply realize that the old approaches to dealing with this problem have failed, have been insufficient, and it cannot be business as usual. Specifically, as far as Africa, I think that by and large, Africa has been fairly even-handed. The chairperson of the commission, when the Hamas attacks happened, came out with a statement immediately condemning the atrocities and the taking of hostages, including children, etc. And then the subsequent response of Israel, which, as I have said, was completely disproportionate. I happened to be with him in Egypt, and together with Arab League, the AU similarly issued a statement saying that, yes, we condemn the Hamas attacks, but now what we are seeing is a total violation of international law, and particularly international humanitarian laws and laws governing warfare. African agency is limited, to be frank, because the big powers, frankly, are the ones who have the leverage. And yet, at this point, we don't see any serious determination to exercise this leverage on, especially Israel, to restrain itself and to return to Resolution 242, which has called for a just and fair settlement of the Palestine issue in recognizing and working to implement the two-state solution, which is by and large the African position on this question.
I think there is so much more to say about this whole topic. And, you know, we haven't really mentioned the West Bank yet, but there's been a horrible escalation of violence there. We haven't talked about the northern border with Lebanon, and there's activity and worries there, though Hezbollah seems to be, relatively speaking, holding back. You have superpower interest, you have the regional factors all around, you have a violent conflict. I mean, I'm not sure of the numbers in 2023, but last year there was armed conflict in 56 countries. And then we focused everything onto thinking about Ukraine and talking about that. And now the mind moves on and we're thinking and talking about Israel, Palestine. But in a world of conflict, then this conflict is one that so engages so many people, so their minds and their hearts as well. But I do want to move on now, and I'm relying on the audience having enough time in 20 minutes, 25 minutes to come back and to be raising questions. So I want to move on to the more, as I said, questions which I've warned my board members about. And I thought that, again, Jessica, I would start with you, although I'm not going to go so robotically down the panel as I did before. And, you know, these days, if we think about America, there's kind of just a couple of people we're thinking about. So tell us about them.
Well, it's hard to live in a country where you feel like 40% of the population has gone insane. And really, as each day passes, it feels more and more like that, and feels incomprehensible where we are. And I don't think anybody understands either fully how we got here. I mean, one of my responsibilities is writing short book reviews that appear in the back of Foreign Affairs, our principal foreign policy journal. And so every 2 months I get 50 or 60 books, and I have to pick 5, and I write short reviews. And so I've probably read 20 books in the last 4 or 5 years about Trump and how we got him. And I still don't think anybody understands it. I understand pieces of it. And a large part of it is that starting in 1968, the white, blue-collar, working-class Americans who had been until then the core of the Democratic electorate went to George Wallace in a heavy proportion. And George Wallace had run previously and was a Southern racist, segregationist, standing in the doorway of the schools, there'll be no integration. But he ran in 1968 as a populist, as a New Deal populist. And a big hunk of this vote of the white working class said the Democrats have left us. They haven't, in fact, done what they said they would do, pursuing our interests, our economic interests, and they went to Wallace. And that started the wholesale movement of this big population into the Republican Party, which, paradoxically, doesn't even talk about pursuing their interests, much less delivering. But there's so much anger stored up at the inequality and the lack of social mobility in what's happened in the United States that they've stayed there. So we're now kind of just split. And a whole heavy hunk of the American population is mostly motivated by anger and fear of, and it's also pretty clear that we were not ready for a black president when we elected one. So next year, which I assume what you're asking about, nobody knows. But the last thing that's really hard to understand is how come Biden is so unpopular. We all know that he looks older than he is, or acts older, seems older on TV. But this has been, by all measures, an incredibly successful administration, both domestically and internationally. And, you know, when you only think about where we would be, where Ukraine would be under a Trump administration, it would be gone. Right? Where this current crisis would be, where half a dozen other things would be. From day one, he focused on rebuilding relationships with Europe, with Asia, with extending them. We are in a completely different situation now than we would have been. And domestically, 3 major, huge economic bills. The United States is doing better economically than any other rich country. We never had the recession that people predicted. Inflation has come down, employment has gone up, and the man is at like 40% approval rating or 38% or something. It's really weird. And so in terms of nobody knows what will happen if Trump is found guilty in any of these trials before the election, whether that will simply reinforce the anger in his supporters or whether there will be people who peel off. Just to finish, I mean, I used to think until 3 weeks ago that I could not imagine that there was anybody else who didn't vote for Trump last time who would vote for him now. You know, it's hard to imagine where anybody would sort of come towards him, but that it was pretty easy to imagine why some people would move away. But the polls don't show it. And, you know, you all know our crazy system with the Electoral College. It's 70 or 100,000 votes that will decide this election in 5 states. And, you know, those states are Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan.
Ohio?
No. Well, Ohio is not. No, I said Pennsylvania. It'll come to me in a minute. Well, Wisconsin is now in the process of a redistricting, so it will be, so you know, and so
Tell
right
me-
now the polls show Trump winning rather handily, which now, and everybody agrees that polls a year ahead of time can change drastically. At this point in the Obama administration, he was at 17%. And Time and Newsweek had him on the cover saying the president is toast. So I can't say anything more honest or more accurate than that nobody knows, but it is terrifying. It is terrifying. So
Thank you for those words of comfort.
Yeah.
In that case.
you might as well share it with me. It's because there's nobody who doubts that a second Trump administration would be far worse than the first.
Okay, so I wanted to come to Mohammed, please, and to ask you about one of the issues I think that is quite large in people's understanding about reactions to Ukraine and reactions to over Israel-Palestine, which we've already gone into somewhat. But to what extent do you feel that there is that we are seeing this kind of, within the context of the changing world that we've taken as being part of our umbrella for talking about world politics today, what is often referred to as a north-south divide. I mean, how real is that? How meaningful is that from where you stand?
Well, I mean, one indicator of how real it is when you see all these statistics coming out about how the gap is widening between northern countries and southern countries. So we begin to feel that, I mean, the international system as it is unequal, it's unfair. And then if you look at subsets such as trade, it's not improving. In the case of Africa, Africa's share of global trade has declined from about 5.2% in the 70s today to less than 3%. The terms of trade have not improved. And for the most part, although, yes, with Southeast Asia and maybe to a certain extent Latin America, there's been some level of value addition to their products. In Africa in particular, it's still very much raw material exports. And then when you come to precious minerals, and it's still being exported in its raw form, which is problematic, especially with the demographics of large youth bulge. In fact, some people are talking already about a youth quake if something is not done about that. But what can be done is if more of the raw materials were processed, beneficiation, you create employment, at least high-paying jobs at home to keep the youth. So that's certainly one aspect of the international system that southern countries feel aggrieved about. But the second aspect goes to reform of the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions. That economically you have countries that have emerged and others are emerging, and yet the more or less 1945 division of power is frozen. Both in Security Council, after several years of advocacy for reform and promises, and yet we don't see the adjustment to reflect what one would call now a multipolar world and emerging countries. And so there is still this. Then on the other side, the international financial institutions, which also still World Bank, IMF. So you'll see that the last General Assembly, country after country after country from the South, were really very emphatic that the status quo cannot continue. I mean, 70, 75 years on, these global institutions should really reflect the current structure of the world and take on board the demands for reforms which will bring about a more equitable and just international system.
So thank you, Mohammed. And Stefan, this segues into the question I was planning to ask you, because you've co-chaired the high-level advisory board for the UN Secretary General, which was to look at how our common agenda could be implemented. And more broadly, there's the agenda for peace. When Secretary General Guterres was elected, he started in office. He had the prevention agenda. There's a whole set of other things. He's talked a lot, of course, about climate change agenda. And we're heading for a summit for the future in September 2024. In this divided, dangerous, warring world, facing so many problems, and with the pressures that Mohammed is talking about coming, the political pressures coming from countries in the global south. So, yeah, how much sense can be made out of a reform agenda at this time.
Let me start where Mohammed was, because that's the crucial point, and that is that the developed world, North or whatever we call ourselves, need to change attitude, need to change action. We have enough resources in the world to improve it substantially, but they're so this distributed is so wrong. So I think that the North need to be very clear. First, state that we have done enormous mistakes. Just admit that. Redrawing maps of the African continent, we have underinvested and so on. And second, invest and invest a lot. We know we need $4 or $5 trillion to achieve our SDGs. At least, and it's a lot of money, yes, for us, but for the world, no, it is not. If you count the richest people in the world, you come to number 10, then you have accumulated $1 trillion. 10 people in the world. So of course we have the resource. I think that's a mentality we have to show. We are serious. We understand. And that we are talking about investment. Africa is a continent that will grow substantially in terms of population this century, and at the end of the century, African continent will be almost as big as Asia, even not really, but almost, very close to. So there, and a lot of youth. A lot of people in the working force, so you have a huge potential. And investing in Africa and other poor countries, of course, African continent and other poor countries is also something that benefits everybody. So it's good for them, the people there, but also for the world economy. So I think we have to change that. And then we can't give up. I mean, although we're in a very difficult time, no problem, no doubt. But we've been there before. So if you look at the long term, you see, I mean, after the war, everybody said now we will have peace, and then we had the Korean War, we had the Cuba crisis, the Cold War, and all that. So everybody thought this is the only future we have. Then came post-Cold War, so everybody thought, well, now it's peace, love, and understanding forever. No. So now we're back again. But we can't give up. And what we proposed was, I mean, in the UN system, or the multilateral system in a broader perspective. The UN, as an example, the composition of the Security Council needs to change, taking into consideration that you have huge countries not being represented. We never proposed a detailed change, but we pointed, here's a problem, because it won't be legitimate until it's a fairer decision-making in there. You can even pass the Security Council. If the Security Council is paralyzed, send things faster to the General Assembly for action. Things like that. The multilateral financial architecture, World Bank, always an American director, IMF, always a European. And then we ask ourselves, how come the African continent doesn't trust us? Well, it's obvious. If we think that we are the only ones that can take those positions, it's obvious why they don't trust us. So change that decision making, use the special drawing rights in a better way. Special drawing rights right now are assets for the rich people. So either they are not used, and if they're used by the richer part of the world, instead of making sure that the poorer part of the world can use it. It's at least $500-600 billion. So there's a lot to be done. And I'm glad now that the Summit of the Future, for many that was actually a threat, because not least G77 regarded the SDG Summit this year as the crucial, because they wanted to see that we were serious on the SDGs. Now, I think it was a decent outcome of the SDG Summit, so now we have to move towards the Summit of the Future with confidence and seek for what you call today, earlier, Dan, you said something, peace
fields for the future.
Sorry?
Peace fields for the future.
Exactly, peace fields. That's exactly what we need to look for now. So we know we have to cooperate on health. We know we have to cooperate on climate. We have a number of issues where we need to cooperate. I will end on the positive note. Well, we can't be sure, but let's hope that the visit from President Xi is reasonably successful in U.S. with Biden. Perhaps we have a case where both nations see that we are so interconnected that we can't hurt one another. Because what I hear anyway is that although there has been a discussion of decoupling, now it's de-risking, which is much smarter, and the only, realistic way to go. You can't decouple, because although we have had these fierce feelings between China and U.S., the trade numbers doesn't change that much because they're so interconnected. And perhaps that could be a start of something better. If you realize that, hey, this is not going to help, none of us will be helped by this, perhaps that could be at least a start for something else.
So my master plan is to finish this round of the panel with asking Heng Chi about precisely that summit. But I wanted first to come to Jean-Marie and to continue on from where Stefan was talking about the UN. One of the things that we experienced in the 1990s and the first decade of this century was that the number of armed conflicts was reducing. And that coincided with a change in the capacities of the UN Security Council because the Cold War had ended. There were more peace agreements, there was more peace operations, and there started to be more investment in peace building. And you were indeed involved and part of that in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations during some of those years. So where are we now with that and with the UN's capacity to address some of these conflicts?
Well, to be honest, when I was in charge of peacekeeping in the first decade of this century, maybe there was a bit of hubris, and we should acknowledge it. There was an enormous growth of peacekeeping, a sense of you could re-engineer countries, you could reshape them. And I think today, one, there are doubts on did we know what we were doing? I think we did in a number of cases, to be honest, and the literature shows that actually peacekeeping has helped, as you said, reduce the number of conflict, but we overreached. And there is not in the UN, there was not yesterday and there is not today the capacity to implement these very broad agendas of peace building. I think just the human resource is not there. Nor, by the way, is the acceptance by the countries which, although it's a UN flag, it's not a national flag. They come to see it as a sort of modernized version of a colonial enterprise. So there is doubt on the enterprise. There is less money because all the big payers of the UN, they spent a lot on COVID. Now they spend on Ukraine and other things. So there is certainly going to be less money available. And there is a divided Security Council. And that is more than 50% of the problem, because when the head of a UN mission is not backed in a solid way by the Security Council, the parties to a conflict have a very good nose for smelling differences, and so they exploit those differences, and the position of the UN is immediately dramatically weakened. So where does that leave us? I think that when you look at the long arc of peace operations since the first days in the Middle East and Kashmir, to the Suez operation, to the the first Congo operation, to the enormous expansion of the first decade, peace operations have been pronounced dead a number of times. If you had asked me the question in 1998 or early 1999, probably would not have been much belief in a resurrection of peacekeeping. And a few months later, there would be Kosovo, then there would be all that Timor, all that followed. today, I think that, and we discussed Gaza and the Middle East, at some point there is a need for legitimacy. And of course, the Security Council, all that has been said on its non-representative composition is true. But at this stage, you're not going to create an alternative UN. It's not going to happen. And so the only legal source of legitimacy remains the Security Council. And when you have a vacuum of legitimacy, you turn to the Security Council. And so I do believe that because of that, there will still be situations in which the international community will turn to the Security Council. But we have to be smart about it. That is, have much more limited ambitions than the one we have. One. Second, be able to work with other organizations, and I think in particular of the African Union. And we haven't gotten the relationship between the African Union and the United Nations right yet. I think I'm not in total agreement with the Secretary General Guterres when he says, okay, well, the AU will do the enforcement and the UN. I don't think that will work at all, to be honest. I think this is a division, that clear division of labor will depend on the situation. There will be situations where one organization does peace enforcement and another does more sort of stabilization, traditional peacekeeping. It will vary. The case of Gaza, and I would add the West Bank, because you're right, this is a tragedy just waiting to happen and to explode, with the settlers now let loose and doing all sorts of horrible things in the West Bank. At some point, as we were discussing in the first part of this meeting, I think that the UN will be, even if it doesn't love it, because it's not something that anybody would like to do, it's really horribly difficult, but I think the UN will probably have, at least in Gaza, some political responsibilities. What kind of security arrangements will be agreed? Will there be something with Arab countries? Will there be new players like China getting involved? Countries that would be acceptable to all sides? I don't know. Israel certainly will want the fundamentals of its security guaranteed by itself and by the United States. It will not delegate that to any other organization. But in between, there can be some role, I think, for the UN. And the UN, like I see the parades, I live in New York, and I see the parades on Fifth Avenue, and at the end of the parade, there is always a cleanup crew. And I think that's what the UN is. It's a thankless task, but it's a task that there's nobody else to perform, and the UN will have to do it. So I think peace operations are here to stay, but probably in forms that we haven't yet completely imagined.
So thank you very much, Jean-Marie, and especially for the image of the UN as the global cleanup operation. And I wanted to move then to Patricia and to a different dimension of conflict, dispute, and of the divided world system, which is around Russia has just withdrawn from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
No, it hasn't.
It's suspended
No.
its participation. All right, it's
They've
done whatever it has,
de-ratified.
de-ratified. And it's finally the Convention on Forces in Europe, conventional forces in Europe. That's a dead letter. Right. So where are we now with arms control, and to what degree do you think that there is going to be a revival of concern, of activity about arms control? Or is that something else that we should we need to find an alternative to?
Right, so I would say we're in big trouble. You're right that Russia has so-called de-ratified, which is not a verb or something that we've ever heard before. It's a new word, I think. It may exist in Russian, I don't know. And what it has done is remove the instruments of ratification through the Duma and then by presidential decree as a result of the Duma's decision in both houses, so that it is still a signatory in the same way that it says so to be equal to the United States and China, that are both signatories but not ratified. Of course, most of the states in the world have ratified and are full states party, so Russia is removing itself from that wider group as well, and that includes, by the way, the UK and France, the other two nuclear weapon states. So I think that we have a real sliding away. We're seeing this with a build-up of nuclear weapons as well, all over, including in China, and a modernization of capacity rather than just numbers, I would say. And this, most significantly, this is being connected with these new threats for use of nuclear weapons by Russia. There's the veiled threats from Putin, and then there's more overt threats from some of his political allies, and also from academics that are supposedly got the ear of the Kremlin. And this has caused, I think, a real unsettled situation in where we go with arms control. On the plus side, well, there are some plus sides. One is we have a ray of hope now with China and US starting to talk about nuclear arms control. And we're hearing that on Wednesday there may be the announcement of some limits on AI use, which will mean that the ability for artificial intelligence to interfere with command and control systems of nuclear weapons will be addressed. It'll be very difficult to ensure that, but I think it's important to go down that route. We're also very keen that there might be a statement on no nuclear testing, which would be really important if that can happen, and also on what's called the taboo of nuclear use. And I think if we could, see that Reagan-Gorbachev statement, which was reiterated last year by all of the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that nuclear war can never be won and therefore should never be fought. If we could see that, a version of that reiterated again, I think this would be really important. And this is the first China-US discussions on arms control since the Obama period. It's not going to be about numbers. And I think it's important for us to start focusing on behavior. I mean, the numbers are enormous anyway. The numbers are so huge that to use a few of them, like 100 or so, could result in 10-year global famine. So the numbers are way beyond what might be considered needed, if there's such a thing as needed for deterrence. But it's about how we behave with nuclear weapons. So I would say that also we've got the NPT clearly struggling for relevance in today's world. But we do have this new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that will meet for the second time in late this month in New York. And what's really interesting, it's just been announced that there are going to be 20 observers to that meeting. This is a big step up for that treaty. So I think this is a result of all this very poor behavior coming from Russia. And it may be that we start to see movement in a different direction, pushing for a new, and as you say, reinvigorated approach to what is sorely needed arms control.
So I think, Chi, we've got 2 or 3 references being made towards the summit between Presidents Biden and Xi. Again, from where you see things, what do you expect might come out of that? And then let me just say that after this, then we'll open up for questions. And Lucas, I hope there'll be a hand mic.
Okay. First of all, Stefan and Dan, I didn't tell you, but if I weren't attending this meeting, I would be co-hosting as Asia Society a dinner for Xi Jinping in San Francisco, together with the Council on Foreign Relations, U.S. Committee on China, National Committee on China. Anyway, here I am.
Well,
so
honored.
I can't tell you
We're honored.
everything. Yes. What do we expect out of this meeting? A long-awaited meeting is great that is being held. My foreign minister makes a difference between weather and climate. He said the weather is improving, but the climate has not. White House has really played down, lowered expectations for the meeting. China has also lowered expectations for the meeting. But there are leaks that have come out. And Patricia mentioned some leaks about AI, that the two sides have decided to do something on AI. They're talking about nuclear. John Kerry just went to China. And he stopped by in Singapore at a conference, Bloomberg conference, and he was pressed, what did you agree on? Did you agree on? He said, well, you just wait, you know. Clearly he has something, you know, in his pocket, but he wasn't going to say so. So we may hear something about climate as well. We know that the United States wants to talk to China about Ukraine, about Israel-Hamas war, wants to seek the help. And of course, there's issues like fentanyl. The Chinese want to talk about Taiwan. In fact, Xie Fang, the Chinese ambassador in Washington, just said in New York Times today, oh, there are lots of differences, you know, between US and China, playing down expectations. He said, China does not want the United States to change China's political system. China does not want the United States to launch a Cold War. China does not want the United States to support Taiwanese independence. And China does not want the United States to decouple our economy. So that's what China sees as the big issues, you know. So, and the US has their, you know, don't cross the line on Taiwan. And I think Xi Jinping, this is the big issue for China, the corest of the core issues, Taiwan, drawing the red line, and whether the US understands how important that red line is for China. I think he will try to impress that on Joe Biden. Other than that, I think they will have a reasonable meeting, but you know, the issues are so deep, and we all feel that it's a good thing America reached out to China so consistently this year, high-level meetings. China finally responded because it was just going over the cliff, the relationship. And next year is the presidential elections. It will get worse. So they're just trying to draw back a bit. Next year, they're going to crash again towards the cliff because each party is trying to show the other that they're tougher on China. That's what the elections will be about. So sitting in Southeast Asia, I would say that we are glad the two leaders are meeting, but we know how difficult the whole thing is and how a little balloon, and you don't know what the next thing is going to be, could torpedo a relationship and put it to rest for a very long time. But the signs are good right now. And I've been thinking, you know, that actually the United States has overdrawn China. And China has overdrawn the United States. So you have two big countries dealing with caricatures of each other. They're not dealing with the real thing, you know, and this is what is so difficult. And Singapore, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, we're right there in two hotspots. Taiwan, facing the hotspots, and South China Sea. So we are really very worried and hope something will come out. Okay, so this is a really cheery group, but at least you found some positive elements in there. There's a roving microphone, there's a hand up here, and why don't you start with those two? One at the back, in the back row, and the other, the yellowish arm that was waving in a moment. Just before you
say anything. Could I ask you to say who you are, where you come from, just very quickly? And to the panel, we're not going to be able to answer each question, right? So select, you're going to have a couple of minutes each to reply at the end, with me being impatient to get you to finish so that these good people can go home. But over to you first, sir, and as I say, let us know who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Moberg. I'm president for Swedish MSF, Doctors Without Borders. It's so nice to have the opportunity to ask questions of you who really knows this subject. I have two questions. You can choose whether to pick it up or not. The first one, is it likely that we will see a ceasefire in Gaza before Hamas is completely destroyed? Do you think that is a likely development? The other one, it's so difficult for the world to keep more than one or possibly two conflicts in at the same time on the agenda. 20 years ago, many of us did our first missions in Darfur. Maybe you know, but the similar things are unraveling now in Darfur. Will we see more and more conflicts going on, behind or in the shadows of these big conflicts that we see, like Gaza and Ukraine now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And right there was, as I said, a yellowish arm that I couldn't see who was on the other end of it.
My name is Fabia Midman. I work currently for UN Habitat. It was said recently that more than 8 bombs on Hiroshima were used as powder on Gaza by the IDF, by the Israeli army, which means a horrible thing. And in an interview this weekend, President Macron said that we all support the right of Israel to defend itself, and we all feel with Israel the pain it has been through. But we also expected that because Israel is a democracy, that it will abide by international humanitarian law. We don't see this, we can't, he said, collateral damage cannot always involve so many civilian casualties, involving children, women, elderly, and so forth, and innocent civilians. My question is Israel a democracy? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Is Israel a democracy? Lucas, can you bring it down here to the ambassador here?
Thank you very much. First, Dan, I wanted to congratulate you for your expertise in drugging a very large audience here, composed of prominent students and specialists. And also, I wanted to congratulate the panelists because first I thought I was bringing in my bag an armada of questions, but they stripped me of my questions because of the high quality of their interventions. I wanted really, and then also the balanced views we have seen today, we have listened. I don't have questions, as I said, but I have some remarks to do.
But please, very quickly, because there are many others who want to ask questions.
Yes. I will be very brief. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most complex, and probably the most complex in the world now. So the enemy number one of the conflict is to approach it with a simplistic view. So, for example, like saying that, of course, we remove one head of government or we extract Hamas from Gaza to put the order in the house, I don't think it will achieve any result in that. Second, it's not also in building a coalition of countries like the international community was successful to do it when the war was waged against ISIS. So I don't think Hamas is ISIS also. Second thing is that for Western countries, we do understand that they have a passionate relationship and attachment to Israel. There is a common history, there is the weight of history, of culture, of everything. But please, I don't know how to say it, but please put into account the respect of international law when you have such passion for Israel. International law has to prevail, and then passion would be very much, how to say it, experienced between the two elements.
Can you make this just the last point and then pass it along,
the Western
please?
narrative, it has worked for some years, but now, probably in the future, we will listen to another narrative that would be quietly different from the one that we have listened to before. The call of a two-state solution is also simplistic. It could work, but unless we are under a new configuration of the international architecture, so we cannot.
Please, sir. Okay.
The last point.
No, I think that was the last point. Could you pass the microphone to the lady along the road, please? Okay. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but there are so many people who wanted to speak. I'm sorry.
Hello, my name's Lubna Qureshi, and I'm a historian. The crises in Ukraine and Palestine urgently require objective mediation. Could Swedish membership in NATO possibly affect Stockholm's work in these areas, and possibly even SIPRI's work? Thank you.
Time for a couple more. There was one here. You had your hand up, but make sure it's a question, and then one over there. Yeah, an easy question this time, please.
I don't know if it's easy or not. I'll try. So my question is, what can be said to those who say that international law is a tool in the hand of the North, as you called it, because it's justify invasion of sovereign countries, sanctions in some instances, but it's when it comes to one of the allies of the North or the West, it's more open to interpretation, and we cannot use it. It's not that strong tool anymore.
Okay, and the last question here, sir. Yeah.
My name's Ngobo Fobo, and I'm an independent researcher. And of course, I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to pick on one which echoes all the questions that have been asked. And I think it's about the rhetoric versus actions, just as people have been putting it, how countries should abide to international law. And I think a lot of countries have been, or a lot of politicians at least have been saying, yeah, Israel has the right to defend itself, but of course it has to do that within the confines of international law. And on the other hand, there was a blatant condemnation of Hamas, rightly so. But at the end of the day, if people get really realistic, do the condemnation come because of the manner in which the people are dying, or does the condemnation come because there's a certain limit of people which are dying? Because it looks like even though definitely Hamas had attacked Israelis, but on the other hand, there's been quite a reluctance, if not opposition, from especially Europe, the USA, or the global North, so to say, to actually get the reports that have been done by a credible human rights organization saying what they are doing is tantamount to breaking of international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much for those questions, and you all have to be super selective. We'll start with Mohammed and come, as I said before, robotically along the panel. So you've got about a minute, so it's got to be snappy.
No, just to say that indeed it's regrettable that so many diversions, that situation, for instance, the gentleman from Doctors Without Borders, I think he said, was referring to the situation in Darfur. It's completely horrendous. So Yanir Listen is here, and he knows about 2 decades ago what happened in Darfur. And when I hear that it's probably worse today than it was then you can imagine how really despicable the situation is there. But it's the reality, and it's regrettable. and the international community just seems to be paralyzed, underscoring once again that perhaps the systems we put in place after 45 have become dysfunctional. Has a real need to reconfigure and recalibrate international peace architecture to make it truly workable.
Thank you. Jean-Marie?
I don't know which question. I would say that the question, is it likely that we'll see a ceasefire before Hamas is destroyed? I think it points to the fundamental issue of this operation is that nobody knows when Hamas will be destroyed. There will not be any objective criterion, and it's probably that if Hamas is ever destroyed, that would mean that other terrorist groups would surge. So in a way, it's an open-ended issue, which raises the question of international humanitarian law, because the truth of it, I think, and I experienced it in peacekeeping when we had operations in Port-au-Prince against gangs. The US experienced it in Mogadishu after Black Hawk Down. A military operation in a dense urban environment is the nightmare of any army. And it's almost impossible to conduct the operations without committing war crimes, because you are being shot at from a building. What do? You make sure that in that building there are no civilians, but your enemies actually want the civilians to be there. So it's an impossible situation. And so it raises the fundamental question of what is a wise answer for Israel after the horrific attack of Hamas. And I think because there was no change of government, it was politically impossible for this government not to react by sort of a massive bombing and ground operation that it is now doing. I would think if the government had the decency of resigning because of the massive failure of its conduct, another government could have said, we have suffered something terrible. We will make sure that all the people responsible for it will eventually get at them in one way or another, but we're going to take a deep breath before an immediate military reaction. Israel would have gained the support of the world doing that.
It's worth thinking about, isn't it, Patricia?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if you look at the way the US has been trying to deal with this, along with other allies, it's been obviously talking behind the scenes to Israel to try to prevent that. I mean, I think the first 2 weeks was very much about that. And then also to other countries in the region, because I think what we all fear, in addition to this terrible situation, is that it then escalates. So a large part of what we're seeing is attempts to prevent escalation to a wider war in which you'll see millions of deaths. I mean, this is what it's terrible now. It could be so much worse. So let's be aware that when we hear all of these things going on and the way in which people are talking to each other, there's a lot behind that. That's just surface. That's surface talk, often to gain trust, to gain access, to get the ear of people in order to be able to prevent even worse things happening.
Thank you. Stefan?
Can Sweden play a role also after becoming a NATO member in different ways? Yes, I mean, there's nothing to say that automatically cannot. I think it has to do with how close that conflict is, NATO members. But I also believe that Norway has proven over the years that they can definitely play an important role, being a NATO member as well. Can SIPRI? Definitely. The more you can stand up for truth and facts, and this is it, the better you're suited to be a part of conflicts. And that trust in SIPRI is there as far as I can see. So definitely SIPRI, yes. And don't forget, it's not the Swedish International, it's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Thank you.
I'll take up the question from the lady at the back who asked if we think Israel is a democracy, because I do quite a bit of study on democracies. I would say all democracies are flawed, you know, and Jessica has been telling you how flawed the US democracy is. And I think Israel, through different governments, you know, you change. And right now, because of the changes to the judiciary, which Prime Minister Netanyahu sought to achieve, that certainly shook even the Israeli body politic to the core. And you have all the stories, you know, about reservists who said they didn't want to serve such a government. So Israel, I would still say, is a democracy, but it is weakening and something has to be done. But just remember, I think today, you know, especially with technology now, the way it is, and social media and so on, it's very difficult to run a democracy that the way we understood the democracies to be in the 1950s and so. And I'm sure we never had a really perfect democracy. So, you know, I come from a country where I say, yeah, we are a quasi-democracy, you know, but it's good governance.
Jessica.
I want to just say a couple of things that were not asked. One is about NATO. I think if Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, he will take the United States out of NATO. And think what that means. Number two, yes, Israel is a democracy. It's a threatened democracy in the same way the United States is threatened, and partly for the same reason, which is that you have a leader who is thinking about going to jail, and personally. And a lot of what he does is defined by that in the same way that an awful lot of what Donald Trump does is being defined by a fear of going to jail. And so I see, you know, I think what was said about what Netanyahu could have done and in some ways should have done would be impossible because he doesn't want to go to jail. Yeah. And so I guess I would just want to underline the threat that I think the world is facing in the current situation in the United States, because for all of the mistakes the United States has made internationally, especially in the last 30 years, 20 years plus, the world without a responsible, internationally committed America is going to be a world in a big, big, deep mess. And I think that's what we face. The fifth state was Nevada.
So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you also for the questions. Thank you all for coming out this evening to listen. I hope you have found it interesting and worthwhile. I hope you do not find it too depressing, though they are a gloomy bunch, as I told you. One of the things which I think is interesting is I never, you know, like some years back when I started studying international relations, peace, conflict, and so on, I never thought that I would come to a point where I thought that international law is really, really fundamental to an awful lot of the issues that we face, the breaches of international law and the chance through international law to be at least controlling and limiting the damage. My younger radical days had absolutely nothing to do with international law, but I think I am not less radical than I was. I think it's simply that as the world has changed, as we have become more closely connected, as the chance actually to be some kind of world society begins to grow, then as our differences become, in some ways, ever more sharp and explosive, we have ever more need of international law to be regulating that behavior. So that's the thought I'll leave you with on this cold Monday night in November in Stockholm. Thanks very much, everybody.